The following story has been brought to you by StoriesToInspire.org.
This story was said over by Rabbi Zilberstein. It was the story of a bacher that Le'aleinu was diagnosed with the dreaded illness with the machla, and the doctors prescribed to him rounds of chemotherapy. He traveled to Tel Aviv, to Tel HaShomer Hospital, and when it came time to get the first round of chemotherapy, the nurse told him you have to go into one of the side cubicles and you have to put on hospital gowns. You have to put on the hospital gowns that they give each of the patients and come back. So he puts on the gown and he puts his talis cut and he puts his tzitzis on top of it. And he comes back and she says to him, I'm sorry, you can't wear those tzitzis. He goes, what's wrong? She says, they're not sterile. And we have to have a sterile environment. There's a lot of people here who have, very low resistance, and because of that, you can't wear it. What was he supposed to do? So he takes off his tzitzis and he takes the chemo and comes home feeling very lousy. A week later, he had to come back for his second round of chemotherapy, but this time he came prepared. He felt guilty the whole week that when he was receiving treatment, which was supposed to give him refuah, he wasn't wearing his tzitzis. This time he brought a freshly laundered pair of tzitzis. It had been cleaned with detergent. It was perfectly clean. And he comes in there and the nurse is there again, and the nurse says to him, before we give you the chemo, go into the room, gown, you have to put on the hospital stuff, and once you have that on, you could come back. This time too, puts on his hospital gown, he comes back with his tzitzis on top of the hospital gown. And she says to him, I'm sorry, you can't wear the tzitzis. He goes, I know, you told me last time. So this time, I was careful, I was meticulous, I don't want to lose the mitzvah of tzitzis. I bought a fresh pair of tzitzis that I never wore before. I just put them on this second. They're clean, they're sterile, nothing's going to happen. And the nurse, who was not so accommodating, unfortunately, and didn't realize how important the tzitzis, said, Im yesh tzitzit en tipul. If you're wearing your tzitzis, you don't get the chemotherapy. He says, man, he starts begging and pleading, and he says, I'm sick as it is, you can't have rachmanis, it's not going to hurt anyone. This is how it is. Yesh tzitzit en tipul. The boy decided, you know what, it's not worth not wearing his tzitzis. And he walks to the waiting room and he sits down in the waiting room again. He's sitting there in his hospital gown. He's sitting there with his tzitzis. And he's sitting there for a half hour, an hour, and periodically the nurse comes out and says to him, take off the tzitzis, you can come back in. It's getting late. He says, Lo, ani lo mevater al mitzvat tzitzit. I am not willing to compromise when it comes to tzitzis. 2 hours after the young man was sitting there, the head of the machlaka, the head of the department, comes in there. And he sees a boy sitting there in his gown and his tzitzis. It's just strange. What's he doing there? So he goes over to the boy and he says to him, Mayesh, what's going on? And the boy shares the whole thing. How the previous week she made him take his tzitzis off. And this week he brought a clean pair of tzitzis and she doesn't want to give him the tipul. And the head of the machlaka got very upset. And he says, Bechlet, 100%. You don't always have to stick by the book. And mitzvah tzitzis and mitzvah chashuvah. And if it's important to you, of course, I'm going to go in there and I'll sort it out. The doctor comes in there, he comes back 5 minutes later, and he's white like a sheet. He's shaking like a lulav. And he says to the boy, you have no idea what happened. I went to the nurse, and I told her off, and I redirected her. But I figured, you know what? I just want to make sure that everything is good. You earned my trust, and you earned my respect. And I went and I checked the bag that had been set up for you, the bag with the chemotherapy. And I realized that accidentally, the nurse had taken the wrong bag. Had you received this bag of the alternative treatment a week after you had the previous chemo treatment, I don't think you would have survived the treatment. And he says to the boy, Yesh Elokim, there's a God. Hatzitzit shelachem, your tzitzis, hitzilu et chayecha. They saved your life. He was beside himself. He couldn't believe it. That's the merit of wearing tzitzis. Now, we don't wear tzitzis to get these chusim and to get these hagana and to get this protection. But when a person is meiser nefesh for the mitzvah of tzitzis, when tzitzis is more important than anything else in their life, then certain segulas, certain amazing things come along with this chus of being mekayim the mitzvah.
Enjoyed this story? Come again. Bring a friend. StoriesToInspire.org